Ooh, new production photos. See what these look like. Alright. Groovy. Okay. Wonder what the fan reaction is to this.
I will never forgive them for what they've chosen to do with the woke cast. Vigilforts is brown now, Rangella Vigo is black, Yen is Indian. What the f?
Please, turn on the lights.
I hope they care to make a good, interesting show, because so far I am asking, is this the Witcher universe? Or is this US social justice war to pretend they are so woke that it will be Like, is their goal to have 0% white cast? Because they successful in that so far.
We was dwarf kangs.
Since when do elves have such variation in skin pigments?
Since wokeness!
Well, looks like I gotta do this. Yes, I actually wear pants during filming because I'm a professional. Here's the thing. I get a little annoyed whenever I see someone talking about this as a woke thing. People of color have been in Western European stories for centuries. This is not a new occurrence. The main reason they have appeared in these stories is because they live there as well. Now, this is a huge and complex issue. What I will be going into is the history of both actual POC groups in Western Europe and how POC appear in medieval media. But for time's sake, I'm going to break this up into two videos. So come along with me, as we, first and foremost, check the history. Do you have any idea how hard it is to look like a pretentious YouTube video essayist when I switch to an e-reader? Look at my impressive stack of one tiny electronic tablet full of a library of books. It's hard to be a snob. That's why I got this leather cover. That, and it reminds me of the diary from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
It's Dad's Grail Diary.
The history. An African man of 20 stands in the north of England, near modern-day Newcastle on Tyne. He's getting used to the cold, wet air. The former slave of the empire he now fights for, freed by his former master. He fights with a cavalry force to expand the control of the empire. He stands next to men of his homeland, fighting against these people the Romans call Caledonian. They look similar to some of the Romans. They still fight, but Victor and his company hold Fort Arbea on the wall, Emperor Hadrian's wall. Hadrian commissioned this wall to be built in 122 AD, and after 6 years it spanned the width of the island, 73 miles of stone with little forts along the way, holding the line against the Britons. Victor died in service of this empire. His former owner, Numerianus, ensured his burial and left this to commemorate his sacrifice. The plaque reads,
"To the spirits of the departed, and of Victor, a Moorish tribesman, aged 20, freedman of Numerianus, trooper of the 1st Cavalry Regiment of Asturians, who most devotedly conducted him to the tomb."
Further inscriptions discuss the auxiliary divisions of Moorish soldiers that served on the wall. This was a very common practice for the Romans. They would take units of soldiers from one area and transport them across the empire to fight. This way, they wouldn't be fighting their own people. They would be representatives of the Empire of Rome. Think of themselves as Roman. The Roman record is full of these examples. Emperor Septimus Severus's biography spoke of an Ethiopian soldier who was known as the jester of his unit. Also common among Roman troops was the practice of settling where they served. As opposed to traversing the hundreds of miles after their service to lands they used to call home, many would stay where they served and live out the rest of their lives. As they generally served with folks from their home regions, they would set up their own little communities far away from where they used to call home. There is evidence of an Afro-Roman British community near what we now call York. Researchers from the University of Reading found the remains of an African, possibly of mixed race woman, buried with the cultural items of her homeland, including ivory bracelets, blue glass jars, and a Christian inscription. There is clear evidence of African residents in Britain from the Romano-British period. Paul Edwards, inaugural chair in English and African literature, Edinburgh University. When you think of England as it is today, it is comprised primarily of Celtic Britons, the Germanic Angles and Saxon tribes that came over in the 5th century after the Roman withdrawal, and the Normans.
Norman?
You may have even heard the term white Anglo-Saxon Protestants before.
Look, Chris, it's a whole family of wasps.
My Margaret, what a subpar ham.
These people would have been there prior to the Anglo-Saxon migration. There are even English people who may be unknowingly genetically linked to these Africans. A 2007 study of Y-chromosomal DNA testing of men in the Yorkshire area, around that ancient area where these African communities would have settled, found that 7 of 18 men who had a rare East Yorkshire surname possessed a Y chromosome belonging to the Y phylogeny haploid group A. This is not found in Western European or British genetic groups. It is found specifically in West African groups. Now, this data was not hyper-specific due to the lack of genealogical records in the surnames, but they know that the Y chromosome dates further back than the 18th century. The surname linked to the Y chromosome had existed for over 700 years. These individuals looked indistinguishable from British without this Y chromosome. Over the years and generations, the traces of their Black African heritage on their physical features had faded away. There was also Saint Maurice. According to the hagiographical information, hagiography is the biography of a saint or ecclesiastical leader. They are known to be idealized accounts of this person's life. Saint Maurice was born in, what was the name of that city again?
Thebes. City of the Living.
Yeah, that one. He was the leader of a Roman legion from Thebes in the 3rd century. They fought in Gaul, or modern-day France. The Emperor Maximian ordered his legion to harass local Christians. Saint Maurice and his Christian Theban legions refused. So the emperor ordered a decimation, the execution of every 10th soldier. The legion still refused. So a second decimation was ordered. Are we at a kinemation at this point? When Saint Maurice and his troops still refused, Maximian ordered the execution of the entire legion. They died in Switzerland, and it is commemorated by the Abbey of Saint Maurice. Now, Maurice literally means dark-skinned. His earliest depictions in the Middle Ages show him as a black Egyptian. According to Robert Suckale, it wasn't until the ramping up of the Atlantic slave trade in the 16th century that the whitewashing of Saint Maurice took place, where we started to see him depicted as a white or charitably light-skinned Arabic. St. Augustine, one of the 4 great Latin doctors of the Catholic Church, was also African, born in what is modern-day Algeria. There is dispute to what his skin color is, with no definitive answers. And that to me is telling of the nature of the world at the time. He could reasonably have been of sub-Saharan African descent, or Roman, or more probably, Berber, or North African descent. Now those are more in the classical era. However, medieval European society had PoC all over it. As Maghan Keita notes in her book, Race, What the Bookstore Hid, Why the Middle Ages Matter, Medieval Light on Modern Injustices,
the African in medieval Europe is also referenced extensively in the primary sources. 9th century Irish annals and a 13th century history of the Earls of Orkney both record the presence of black slaves arriving from Islamic Spain. Medieval Irish scribes refer to these as blamana, literally blue men.
Cultures interacted, cultures clashed, wars were fought, and people mixed. Now, of course, there's the big example from that era, Attila the Hun. Now, when you think of Attila, you may think of this guy. Now, that's Gerard Butler. He's Scottish. Attila was most definitely not Scottish. Museums in Hungary have him depicted like this. He had a vast empire that stretched from the Ural River to modern France. The Huns were a Eurasian steppe tribe. Genetic testing from 2018, 19, and 2020 all pointed to the origin in the Xiongnu. Xiongnu were the dominant power in the steppes of East Asia in the 2nd century BC. They were from an area now known as Mongolia, which means the Huns were probably of Mongolian Chinese descent. They were East Asians. So, folks of East Asian descent were living in an area we would now refer to as France in the 5th century. Europe is full of folks with this genetic heritage. There is this common refrain amongst medievalists that discrimination by skin color just didn't exist in this time frame. This is just something that doesn't seem to hold up in the evidence of the time. As Paul H.D. Kaplan states,
in the earlier Middle Ages, black-skinned people were often characterized as evil in text and image, but by the 12th century, a more positive view began to gain ground.
Specifically, black Africans started to show up a lot in European art around 1100. You can find examples of this from the phenomenal medieval PoC blog and Twitter account. Sadly, they seem to be inactive, but the archives are still there and you can check it out. A lot of this increased contact was due to black Africans fighting in the Crusades amongst the Islamic armies. Moving on to Frederick the Great of the Holy Roman Empire. The Hohenstaufen dynasty had a great interest in black African Sicilian populations of the 12th century. This dynasty actually used the image of black Africans in their kingdom as a sign of legitimacy to their broad global rule. This would continue throughout the art of the Holy Roman Empire. This image from Frederick II showcases his cosmopolitan empire. The issue with this is European history writers of the past did their best to exclude these people from the books. Per the book, Germany and the Black Diaspora, Points of Contact, 1250 to 1914 by Misha Honeck, Martin Klimke, and Anne Coleman, discussing the courts of Frederick II.
From the very emergence of modern national historiography, European historical memory has excluded or marginalized people of different ethnocultural, religious, and other groupings in past European societies. Black Africans were part of these societies, but only now have they become a topic of general interest. Owing to the work of pioneering Black European studies authors like Hans Werner de Brunner, Alison Blakely, Peter Martin, and others, Black Africans and their descendants have now been attested in various, and not always marginal, positions in Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. For centuries, Black Africans were a distinctive part of European court culture. Early evidence of their presence can be found in the cosmopolitan court of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, the German king, Roman emperor, and successor of the Norman kings in Sicily. His court, a center of intellectual exchange in his time, shows Black Africans in an array of positions that would later recur in Renaissance and Baroque court culture.
The racial merging of white with being European has little historical or contemporary merit. More than a few scholars have identified the presence of peoples from every continent, including Africa, on European soil dating back to antiquity. Of course, this includes the territory that eventually became Germany. An enduring symbol of this diverse habitation is that the oldest skull found in Europe, discovered in Dusseldorf in 1856, was African. Individual Africans appeared in the area dating back to the days of Julius Caesar, and groups of Africans have settled in the region since at least the 12th century. During their 800-year occupation of southern Europe, the Moors came to Germany from northern Africa during the Middle Ages, and a number of them began to achieve prominent positions as poets, scholars, philosophers, religious leaders, and even part of the royal family. While the black German Roman Catholic patron saint, St. Maurice, is of African descent and well known, there are numerous religious-oriented statues of blacks that can be found around the country. As the historian Gustav Jehoder notes, in the 13th century, German Emperor Frederick II of Hohenstaufen had blacks guarding his treasures.
Mind you, this is a kingdom of Central Europe during the reign of a monarch that lived between 1194 and 1250. This is smack in the middle of the Middle Ages. I want to take you on a little bit of an aside for a moment. I tweeted out this picture saying that the video isn't even about Vikings, and I kind of wanted to explain that. I had found some evidence of there being Black African Vikings. Now, when I say Vikings, I mean Norse pirate raiders. Being Viking is not a culture, it's a job. After finding the evidence, I wanted to investigate it a little bit more. You see, I saw quotes from a book on a website that purported to be evidence for Black African Vikings being members on raids, even stating that a rather famous Viking, Halfdan the Black, was actually called that because he was of mixed Black African descent. So I ventured out to find the book where it was quoted. This book, A History of the Vikings by Gwyn Jones. I read everything I could to try to confirm this information. It would have been really cool to be able to say in this video that I could definitively state that they were Black African Vikings. But to be honest, I can't say that with any authority. The evidence is, in my opinion, a little too weak to say that with confidence. Could there have been Black African Vikings? Yeah, maybe. The Viking raiders did trade with Africa. This is absolutely certain. They sold Gaelic, Irish, and Celtic slaves to Africans and Arab communities. They may have bought some African or Arab slaves in return. But the Vikings were notoriously cruel slavers, and I couldn't find any concrete evidence of Black African Vikings going out on raids. I say this because I want folks to understand I'm not trying to hold up any flimsy argument online as evidence to prove my point. I saw a lot of wild claims made by very confident people about POCs in Europe and elsewhere. The things they claim could have been absolute gold for this video, but I couldn't confirm it with some evidence or some sources. I did not include them here. I'm not trying to make propaganda. I am researching the research to make sure that it's right. And I may still get some things wrong. But I wanted to deliver the most real history that I could. Anyway, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a peek behind the process so you knew what was going into this video. Medieval Spain. So Spain has an amazing history. From its pre-Roman population of Celts and Iberians to Carthaginians, to the Roman conquest, to the Visigoth kingdoms, to the Umayyad Caliphate and the Reconquista, to the unification of the Empire of Spain and beyond. It's a whole thing. I can't go into it all. I mean, you have native Iberians conquered by Carthage, with Phoenicians founding cities along the Mediterranean coast. This initiated North African influence on the peninsula. Then the Roman conquest established what I would consider the foundations of modern Spanish culture, with the Latin language and the sense of the people. But even that might be premature on my part. As we've discussed previously, Rome had a habit of taking people from all over the empire and placing them in new places. Emperor Hadrian, remember him, of Hadrian's Wall? He was born in Hispania, the Roman name for Spain. After the Roman withdrawal and the Visigoth conquest, Hispano-Roman and Visigoth intermarriage was initially outlawed, but that soon ended. Roman culture endured on the peninsula. But then, in the 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate came. The Umayyad Caliphate was a global geopolitical juggernaut, one of the largest empires in the history of humanity. It spanned from India and Afghanistan, Turkey, Russia, Italy, Greece, the Sudan, North Africa, and of course, Spain and a little bit of France. It was a massive, multi-ethnic, multi-religious mega-state. It only lasted about another 30 years before falling to internal rebellion. Rulership over occupied Spain changed over the centuries. I think sometimes when we think of conflicts between Christendom and the Islamic world, we think of them as two unified hegemons just fighting with each other. But it was actually many different Muslim kingdoms versus many different Christian kingdoms, all fighting amongst themselves as well as fighting each other. One of the successor kingdoms, the Almoravids, were known to field armies of Berber tribesmen fighting alongside Christian mercenaries. See my politics video about how ideology really doesn't matter. And black African troops from as far as Ghana and the Sudan. These people lived and fought together in Spain throughout the Middle Ages. Moorish rule over Spain lasted 781 years. To give you an idea of time, the Moors conquered Spain before England existed as a country. It is easy to see the influence it has today with the name of the cities in Spain and the beauty of the architecture. Spain, throughout the Middle Ages, was a melting pot, and in my biased opinion, it's part of what makes Spain special and beautiful. In modern Spain, over 1 in 10 Spaniards have Moorish heritage. And according to the DNA test that a family member of mine took, my family's one of them. Considering my Puerto Rican, Spanish, and now North African genetics, for those at home keeping score, that means my ancestors colonized my ancestors who later rebelled, and then those ancestors colonized my ancestors who later rebelled. I have a history. Decolonizing things is harder than some people realize. I can't decolonize myself. And through Spain, African kingdoms had contact with all of Europe. So there is ample evidence of people from all over the world interacting and living in Europe, sometimes from before people that we consider natives got there. I am not in any way trying to diminish Europeans or their accomplishments throughout history, their culture, where they are, or where they call home. Rather, this is a showcase that, in the context of our own history, Europe was more diverse than people think. People didn't stop moving around because of borders that we have today. I wanted to discuss European history because of the incorrect notion that it was a purely white European continent. Examples of cross-cultural, cross-ethnic exchanges showcase all over the continent. I mean, they showcase all over the world. This sort of thing isn't exclusive to Europe. You may have heard of European or Black African samurai in Japan. But because of the acts of post-medieval and post-Renaissance European historians, the story of PoC in Europe have been hidden from us. We didn't learn about it in schools. So when we see a PoC in a piece of medieval-based fiction, we scoff at it and use language like,
"There's no black people in Middle-earth."
Or, "Why is there a brown wizard woman in this Polish fantasy story?" Every time PoCs are put into these stories, it's rallied against as wokeism or social justice warriors infecting fantasy. The truth is, people of color have always been in Europe. If nothing else, I am evidence of that. People of color's history in Europe is literally in my blood. If you still think that Black Elves or PoCs in historical dramas is a betrayal of history or disrespectful of your European culture, please take a second to consider this. To give you a complete picture of my Puerto Rican or Korean heritage, I must also tell you the story of how those people were affected the day Western Europeans arrived. We can't tell our whole story without including you. The history and stories of your people were changed to erase us from it. Why are you trying so hard to exclude us from it now? Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon so you can be notified when new videos are released. Additionally, share this video around, especially when folks say something like, "There were no black people in Britain," or something like that. I'd love to open the minds of more people to learning about the real history behind their homelands. Maybe this will help lessen the feeling of a POC being the other, because in reality, well, we've been here the whole time, in your history, but also in your legends and stories. Apparently Europeans were starting to get woke back in the early medieval period. But hey, we'll get to that in the next video. See you next time.